So those of you that listened into the Pike Canal story last week will have noticed at the end that I promised to come back if we were still in lockdown this week and give you another story. I mentioned a very, very special carp that I was lucky enough to track down from a river a number of years ago. And I think it was a real big challenge for me at the time. So it was a story that I've wanted to tell for quite some time, and not really a story that I told, certainly not in full at the time, for reasons that you'll probably see as we go along. So I'll take you right back to the beginning. I think it was probably around circa 2006, and I was pike fishing one winter on this particular river. Nothing was happening, and around mid-morning, just as it started to warm up a little bit, I had a couple bleeps on one of the rods. The water was low, it was clear, so I snuck down because I was fishing a bait close in and peered over just in time to see a couple double-figure carp amble through, and one of them must have just clipped the line and given a couple of bleeps. Now, I knew that there were carp in the river, but that was the first time that I'd seen them. I didn't really think anything of it. I certainly wasn't going to go chasing these particular fish, but it just was a nice thing to see. However, only a couple of weeks after that, I was fishing on the same river, and an angler came along, started having a chat, and took out a picture of an absolutely beautiful carp. Perfect linear carp, big long fish, big underslung mouth, very, very distinctive one. And straight away I wanted to catch it. And I wouldn't normally ask outright, but this was such a special fish. I said to him, "Come on, like, please tell me where this fish has come from." And it took a little bit of prying, but eventually he told me. He said, "Well, you sat 50 meters from where I caught it," and I couldn't believe that it had come from the river. However, when I looked at the picture, it was obvious that it did tally up with what he was telling me. So the challenge was on. It was one of those that just had to end up in my net. There was no two ways about it. So fast forward to the next close season, and I spent a lot of time, as you can imagine, every warm day I was up and down the bank, Polaroid glasses on, just walking, trying to track them down. Those of you that have read any of my articles before, fished with me, or listened to any of my videos know that location to me is absolutely everything. So first of all, I just wanted to find the fish, work out what they were doing. When you do that, most fish are easy to catch, particularly wild fish in a river environment. However, when I found them, it certainly wasn't when I was expecting them. I'll never forget, I'd actually been away to see family in Ireland over that particular week, and I landed at the airport, which actually involved the plane coming in over the estuary. And I got it in my head, why don't I go and do a little bit of bass fishing? So drove down there later on that day and ended up in this particular spot, lure fishing for bass on an estuary. So as you can see, that is not your wood-chipped carp swim down your local day ticket water. That's a typical estuarine environment, only a couple of miles from the sea. So when I got to the swim, first of all, to show you what I found, how tidal it is. So it's actually there's an old lock cutting there, as you can see, and at low water all the mud there is totally exposed. So I got there at low tide, and underneath my feet there's a fast water outlet, and as the tide comes in, all of the sand eels and little fish all congregate around this fast water outlet, and very often lots of mullet would come in there, and the bass would use the mullet as cover, looking very, very similar, and then they'd dart out of the coloured water created by the feeding mullet and grab the small fish. So if you could imitate, using your lure, one of these small fish in and around the mullet, the bass would respond, and it proved to be a great spot for me previously. However, on this day, as the water flooded in, it wasn't mullet or bass that caught my eye. It was two very, very big carp that came in. You're about 30 feet up off the water there in that particular spot, so it's quite hard to gauge their size, but they were clearly really good fish. And I actually ended up watching them. I put the lure rod down, I watched them as the tide came all the way up and dropped all the way back down. And what was clear is just how different their behaviour was from the very careful feeding behaviour that you see from lake fish that are fished for on a regular basis. I watched these fish literally turning over reasonable sized rocks, these two fish almost scrabbling over the food that was coming out from underneath, which was presumably crab, shrimps, whatever it might have been, maybe small fish, but they were almost predatory in their behaviour. And that really kind of backed up what sort of opportunists these wild river fish are. So I watched them all the way up on the tide. I fed them my sandwiches, everything else that I had to throw at them just to keep them there and watch them. And eventually the tide dropped, just leaving a shallow gravel bar. They were still feeding, and I couldn't see how they were actually going to get back into the estuary. But what became clear, and luckily I did manage to catch it on camera, as you can see, that carp there is half out of the water. That one's about a third of the way out of the water, and they've just powered over the top of this bar without a care in the world to get back into the main river. So, like I say, the behaviour compared to the carp that I was used to fishing for was absolutely bizarre, but amazing to see, and real kind of eye-opening behaviour for me. So the hunt was on. I started spending a little bit of time down in that spot, putting a little bit of bait in as the tide turned, sitting there, usually with my bass fishing gear, because obviously this is a closed season, so you couldn't actually fish for the carp themselves. But what I could do is keep the bait going in whilst I went down and did a little bit of bass fishing. And what became clear is that some days 2 carp would turn up, sometimes only 1, other days 6 or 8. It didn't matter how much bait you threw in, they smashed the lot, and they smashed it within minutes. There was no upper end of how much bait you could put in. I just started putting more and more in, just more than anything to see their reaction. And it didn't matter if you put a bucket of bait in. If 3 or 4 of these river carp turned up, they would eat everything that went in there. So it was really, really interesting to watch. As we move towards the start of the season, obviously I started thinking, if they're going to hang around here, I'm going to have a chance of getting them. And it was actually on one of these trips, no more than sort of a week or so before the start of the season, that I actually saw the linear for the first time in the water. And firstly, when you've got an area like that, which was hundreds and hundreds of acres that they could disappear into, firstly, it's such a relief to see that your target fish is still alive, because if it's not somewhere that's being fished regularly and you're not seeing the fish, you can easily be fishing for something that's long gone. So it was really, really satisfying to see it in the water. And secondly, in that clear water, what was clear is that it was everything that I hoped it to be. So I kept the bait going in, really excited that I might be able to get a quick capture here. A couple of days before the start of the season, I went down, baited up. It was a morning tide that I baited. I went back in the evening and very quickly realised that something had changed. The tide had gone out, and I could quite easily find bait, the more visual baits like maize and things like that. I could actually still see bits and pieces that had been left behind. So on the next tide that I got down there and watched again, put the bait in, and the carp weren't there. Now, in hindsight, maybe someone saw them and pulled a bit of a naughty one and went and fished for them. Whether they knew something was wrong or whether they just drifted off, I don't know. But one thing was for sure, by the start of the season, when I did set up to fish for them, those estuary fish were long gone. And that proved to be the flavour of things for most of the summer. I got totally kind of transfixed by tracking these fish down, and would go down there at least once every day, sometimes twice every day, at the right times of day, first light, last light, just looking in all the likely places that had done captures before, speaking to people that had fished the river before or seen carp on there before, and just trying to put all the pieces together. But one thing was for sure, those carp weren't anywhere that I could track them down easily. I even put a boat on the river, spent some time out in the boat, had one glimpse from in one particular spot, but when I fished there, they certainly weren't there. It was as if these fish that had just spent so much time in the estuary earlier on in the season had just disappeared. It was like there wasn't a carp in the river anymore, which was really, really kind of like disconcerting that you're not seeing anything. So I did start just choosing some big features and just fishing them, just dropping in for a night or so at a time. Either waking up very disappointed in the morning or reeling in quite large bream all night if I put any bait in beforehand. So that was the first sort of learning curve from a rig and bait perspective. I was probably at that stage going through a phase in my stillwater carp fishing where I'd learnt that kind of scaling down was getting me more bites, but on the river you just couldn't do it. So if you used small boilies, pellets, maize, anything else like tiger nuts, you caught mullet, you even caught bass, you certainly caught some very big bream. There was quite a good head of double figure bream, which is specimen fishing itself in the river at that time, and some half decent chub as well. So if you fished anything small or light, it was an absolute nightmare. So very quickly I scaled up to 35-pound coated hook links. I fished them quite long, around 18 inches, which is very different to what I do in a stillwater situation, where I tend to fish the shortest link that I can on the substrate that I'm fishing on. But no, I lengthened right up so I had a natural presentation. I used balanced baits, and that was generally a 24mm bottom bait, balanced with a pop-up on the top, which might sound very big with a size 2 or 4 hook, but there's a lot of snags in these tidal rivers, and the fish are very powerful as well. And if I was going to get a chance this summer, I didn't want to mess it up through a gear failure. So at the top of the hook link, I had a quick change swivel, and I simply tied the leads to the quick change swivel. These were generally 4 or 5 ounce leads with lead core leaders, anything up to 10 feet long. Firstly, to keep everything pinned down on the bottom, and secondly, obviously, to give me additional abrasion resistance, because when you see the river down empty on a really low tide and you see some of the snags, they're absolutely awful. So you really need gear that can deal with it, and that was 20-pound monofilament main lines go with that as well. So putting in the effort, still walking the river trying to find them, probably walking 9 times out of 10 and fishing the occasional trip, and those trips were more in hope because I still wasn't seeing anything. It got to sort of midsummer and I was going nowhere with this campaign. I felt like I was never going to catch a carp from this particular river. And on one particular day, I wandered up to a weir pool that was on the river, just for a look round. By now it was the summer holidays. There must have been 30-40 kids messing about in the water, swimming, playing ball games in the water, sat round having picnics and so on. I thought, well, these fish aren't going to be here. There's literally people everywhere in the weir. However, there was a gravel bar that runs out sort of diagonally across the weir, and I just walked out onto this gravel bar, flicked my shoes off and walked out in my shorts, and the gravel bar runs diagonally across the weir and drops away maybe 20 yards short of the sill of the weir into deeper water. And just stood there. There was quite a bit of reflection on the water, and just at the bottom of this bar, I just made out a shape come up over the bar and back down the other side. Just a glimpse, but just enough. And it just kept me stood there for another 20 minutes just looking in the same place, because it was a fish. I didn't know it was a carp, and I thought, if a fish has gone on that line, there's a reason for that, and there's a good chance something else will go through there. And I was just getting to the point where I thought, I'm not going to see anything else. It was a one-off, could have been a salmon, bream, whatever down there, could have been a bass, anything. And I'll never forget, out the corner of my eye, I caught the tiniest little movement, and I saw in the flow what I thought was a leaf. And this leaf slowly came to the surface, and I immediately recognised what it was a tiny flatfish, a couple of inches, literally a couple of inches long, and it's come up to the surface, and out off the side of this bar came 2 perch, and they were probably £2 each. And I'll never forget, they chased it to the top. One of these perch engulfed this flatfish, immediately ejected it, and the other one grabbed it, and they turned and went back the way they came. And I stood there and I thought, I could have been stood in this river for my whole life and not seen perch eat a flatfish. It was the most bizarre thing. But anyway, I turned back, looked in exactly where I was looking before, just in time to see a carp drift up over the gravel bar and back down the other side on exactly the same route that the one had taken 20 minutes before. Now that was enough for me at that point. I'd got totally transfixed in this little world in front of me, looking into the water. And it wasn't until I stopped and turned to walk back to the bank again that I looked around me and realised what a bizarre place these fish had actually holed up in. It was the busiest place on the river. There was kids everywhere. There's people playing in the water not 20 yards from where these carp were spending their time in this deeper hole in the weir. But standing there and looking around, it started to make sense. There'd be extra food going in there with the amount of people that were just hanging around there, throwing stuff in. It was a nice deep hole. It was very oxygenated, which is obviously very important midsummer. And it started to kind of make sense. So I had some bait with me, so I walked back out, and it felt a little bit bizarre, kind of stood almost in the middle of all these people, carefully as I can, throwing in a load of 24mm boilies into this deep hole. But to be honest, no one really noticed what was going on, and that was the pattern for the next few days. As I got down there, tried to do it early in the morning when there wasn't too many people about, but obviously you do these things when you can. And what was very obvious was, much like down on the estuary earlier on in the year, everything you put in, it got eaten, and that said to me they were there, they were on the food, and I was gonna catch some fish. So looked at the tides, and what I wanted to do in this particular spot was fish low tides that were either on first or last light, which is obviously a good time to be there. It probably wasn't the best swim for night fishing, in terms of it was kind of on the edge of the city, in a sort of park area, and just from a safety point of view, I don't think it was probably the best place to be spending the night. So I decided initially first and last light on low tides, which gave me a few windows each month to hit it and then to bait it in between. I'll never forget, I was walking over to fish it for the first time, and happened to bump into the lad who showed me the picture of this linear, and he asked me if I'd done much, if I'd caught any, and he'd had exactly the same struggles. He'd been doing a little bit on the river and had really struggled, and basically said I can't find them. So I obviously had to keep a bit of a straight face and said I was going to try further up the river on the non-tidal stretch. Anyway, I soon cut back on my path and went down to the weir, very, very excited for the session ahead. So, got into position. There was a couple of fallen trees where I could put my rods. Didn't bother with buzzers or anything else like that. Just lent the rods up on the branches of this fallen tree. Popped my chest waders on. Put my two rigs in the front pocket of the chest waders with a line over each. Popped the bait runners on. Walked out across the bar until the water level started to come up. Over as the bar dropped away, up over my thigh, up to my waist, and then I could simply just drop the rigs by hand into sort of chest deep water, and then just walk back, drop a couple of back leads under my rod tip because you get quite a bit of debris coming down through over the river there for the few hours of the evening ahead. Now, just as light went, all hell broke loose. So I'll never forget, it was my left-hand rod basically tried to go in the river, even though the bait runner was on, and I had a real struggle getting it out of the tree where I'd wedged it into the ground and against the tree where the rod was bent over so much. The fish took a lot of line straight away, and just as I thought I'd started to turn it, everything went slack and I thought I'd lost the fish. But as I began to retrieve, what became obvious very, very quickly was that the line had broken. I wound it in, and what I was amazed to find was I actually had about half of my 10-foot leg core leader. So whatever was in there was sharp enough to go through 45-pound leg core. So I knew that there was some serious snags. Anyway, I redid the rod. Nothing else happened that particular evening. So I walked out in the dark, just head torch on, walked out in the dark, put some bait in again, walked back, and I was sort of home around midnight and decided to get back at first light. So nipped home, couple hours in bed, back down again, walked the rods out, and by first light, by the first light coming over the horizon, the rods were in, the rod tips were up in the air, just bouncing away gently with the flow, and exactly the same thing happened. I had a very, very powerful take. This time the lead was off quickly, the fish was fighting on the surface, which is exactly what I wanted. I only tied the leads on in that swim with 2-pound line, so the 5-ounce lead was off the line and this fish was tearing around the weir pool on the top. And I had my first capture, which was this lovely common 24-pound. Absolutely gorgeous fish. And I was over the moon because the effort that had gone in just to get this one was absolutely huge. And although by now I'd seen a few different ones in the weir, that wasn't one I'd seen before as well, which just kind of made me think there was a chance of other new fish turning up there as well. So over the next few weeks, I just kept doing the same thing, just making sure that I was there on those what I considered the prime times. I was looking for that window of opportunity of the low tides where I felt the fish would push into that deeper pool in the weir, so the very low tides coinciding with first or last light. And over the next month or so, I was lucky enough to have around 20 captures, including a few repeats. Most of the fish were double figure fish, mainly commons. I did have one other 20-pound mirror, which was a Simo type strain fish, which I presume flooded out of somewhere into the river. But as each capture, normally if I'm fishing that type of water, each capture kind of makes me think I'm getting closer and closer. But on there, I felt I was actually getting further away because there was only a relatively small head of fish, and every time I landed one that wasn't that big one, wasn't the linear, I knew that putting that back in the swim could be the move that makes them all drift off, and I knew that eventually it would be one too many captures and that the remaining fish and the spooked fish would head off. So kept the bait going in. On this occasion I rested the swim for about a week and decided to do a night, which wasn't something that I'd done very much of in that particular swim for the reasons that I mentioned. However, on this particular fateful night, I got down there, walked the rods out in the dark with the head torch on, hardly any disturbance at all, dropped them down, walked back, no shelter, just popped my bed chair out, and I'll never forget, would have been about 10:30 in the evening, only about 20 yards behind me, a load of teenagers arrived on push bikes, set up camping gear. They were drinking, they were smoking, they were having a good time, but they had no idea that I was there sort of fishing just the other side of the undergrowth where they were. And the first couple of hours it kept me awake, but they quietened down, and I soon drifted off to sleep. The next thing, early hours of the morning, and I woke up and just had a sense that something was there. I'll never forget it. And I opened my eyes, put on my head torch, and there in front of me, a foot in front of me, is a pair of eyes just looking at me. And I thought, is it a fox? What is it? But obviously I was pretty scared. And I moved my head and I could see it was a dog. Now, with a footpath only about 20 yards behind me, this dog started barking. So I slowly got up, or just sat upright on my bed chair, and called to the footpath behind and just said, I'm in here fishing, you need to keep your dog under control, because I was worried I've got my rods there, my bait, and there might be rigs and stuff. And I'll never forget the reply: "You'll need to sit down, sir, it's a police dog." So I know I'm in trouble now. So policeman comes round, he's on his radio, and I said, not really doing anything wrong, just doing a little bit of night fishing. Showed him the tackle, I'm just fishing for carp. And he's called someone else, and a head torch came on at the other side of the river, and they're on their radios making a big fuss. And I thought, what's all this about? Eventually, an Environment Agency officer also turns up, and he looks at the gear there, and goes through my rucksack, my tackle box in very fine detail. Still, no one would tell me what it was about, and I'm starting to think, what the hell is going on? Now, what I didn't know was that on some of the nights that I hadn't been going down to bait up, a gang of salmon poachers had been down there putting out big nets across the river. And when I'd gone out sort of late evening, walked my hook baits out with my head torch on, someone had seen the head torch and made the call to the police, and they'd had this a full stakeout with the local constabulary and the Environment Agency, and they thought they'd caught the perpetrators, and were quite disappointed that it was only me hiding in a hedge fishing for carp. I'll never forget, by the time that we finished having a chat about it, they were absolutely fine. It was quite clear that I wasn't doing anything I shouldn't be, and we shook hands, and they went on their way, and I decided to pack up, because it was quite clear that from them putting their floodlights across the weir pool and everything else, that I probably didn't have the best chance. Carried the baiting on for a couple of days, and decided on a first light trip. So got down there again. First light definitely seemed to be the one, and very often by 6 o'clock, when the first dog walkers were going across the park, I'd been and gone, caught a couple of fish, and before the weir pool got busy with kids and everything else through the day. So got down there, got the rods out again, and had another take, and straight away it was clear that this was a big, powerful fish. So I lowered myself down off the bank, pushed the landing out into the water, so that I was down at water level to play it. And between me and where I hooked it is this gravel bar, and the fish shot downstream, probably about 80 yards. I couldn't follow it because the water would be too deep. So I let it go downstream just on a tight line, and then started bringing it up the near margin, which had a deeper channel, which would allow me to play it back to where I was sat. And that seemed to work pretty well. And eventually, the fish bobbed up in front of me. It was clearly a big fish, but it wasn't obvious which one. And I managed to scoop it up into the landing net. It rolled over in the net, and straight away I let out a big cry, because I was absolutely over the moon to land that. They don't get much more special than that. And it was as good a fish as it had looked in the earlier picture. So it's just after first light. I've caught this fish, and I had a friend who lived quite near there who goes off to work quite early in the morning. We had always had an agreement that if I caught the fish, give him a shout, and he'd come down and do the picture for me. So I gave him a call, and unfortunately he was on a call out, and he was a little bit away from the area, and he said, forget the call out, I'll make my excuses, I'll say I've got a flat tire, I'll come back and do the photo. But he wasn't exactly sure where I was fishing. I gave him a basic description, and half an hour later or so, he pulls up in the car park, which would be about a quarter of a mile away, and I saw his van come in through my binoculars. So I started walking over to see him. Now, in all this mayhem of landing this fish and making phone calls and telling friends about it, what I'd totally forgotten is my other rod was out. And I got about halfway across to meet him, and suddenly the receiver in my chest wader pocket just went into meltdown. So I ran back, obviously, over to where the rod was, started playing it, and he wondered what was going on. Obviously, 1 minute I'm walking over to meet him, waving my hand, showing where I am, and he said, you just turned tail and legged it across back to where you come from. Started playing the fish towards me, and I was down in the water next to the linear that was in the retainer, and I couldn't believe it, because it looked like a bigger fish. And I managed to land it quite quickly, and I had it in the net by the time my friend got there. And it was another cracker. Absolutely awesome river carp. And again, not one that I'd seen in the water before either, which made it even more special. You can see there was some tail damage, which unfortunately was a real sign of things to come on that particular venue. So we ended up with doing the pictures of the linear and this other fish, which was a 28 pounder. Did the pictures, popped them both back, and what a highlight to that campaign, and what a way to end after such a difficult start. Months of never feeling like I was ever going to catch a fish from the river. I think I ended up with a sort of 24, 25 captures off of that particular stretch in the end. Pretty much all the ones I wanted, maybe bar one, and I was really happy to draw a line under it. The river started to change a little bit after that, and otters became more prevalent in that particular system. And unfortunately, about 18 months after that, I was fishing down in the estuary one day, and in one of the reed beds, I noticed every time I walked down to reposition my pike rod during the day, there was a smell in the reed bed, like a dead fish smell. And I had a look in there, and unfortunately found the linear with very, very characteristic otter damage, obviously dead. And unfortunately, over the next couple of years after that, a lot of the better fish were lost off the river, which was really, really sad, and kind of drew to an end a really special time for the carp fishing on the river. But that's a different battle, unfortunately. So that brings me to the end of that particular story. It really was a case of perseverance and never giving up, and it really did pay off in the end. So I think that would probably be the main thing to take from that one. Next week, if we're still on lockdown, I'm going to be talking about another special capture. This time it's going to be my first ever double figure tench, which actually becomes the story of my first ever 3 double figure tench, with a very, very big common carp chucked in for good measure as well. And this particular story will just show how making a relatively small change in what you're doing can totally turn results on their head. So hopefully you'll tune in for that one.